There's a lot of fancy jargon used in architecture, and probably one of the most used, or sometimes overused words, is space. You've probably heard people say something like, I love this space, or the space encourages interaction. It's usually on an episode of one of those house flipping shows. But what does that actually mean? What is architectural space? Where does our understanding of space come from, and what makes a good space? Hey everyone, I'm Steve, an architecture student, and welcome to the first episode of our Architecture 101 series. What this series is all about is breaking down those complex but important words and concepts in architecture into easy to understand ways. To start things off, we're going to be looking at architectural space. But before we get into that, I want to encourage you to give us a like and subscribe to the channel for more exciting architecture content. Now with that out of the way, let's get started. In its purest form, space is what's created as a result of the physical stuff that makes up the building, what architects call the form. And the space within a building can greatly affect how people feel in the building. Research in neuroscience in recent years has proven this by using MRIs to analyze our brains as they react to certain architectural spaces. In 2018, a Brazilian researcher named Andreas Dubava conducted research and discovered that our brains break down architectural space and analyze it, picking up certain symbols from the architectural features and interpreting them to create a feeling of the place. One of the examples that she gives in her research is that our brains will infer from a space with high ceilings, for instance, as being open, and in turn gives someone a greater sense of freedom. And interestingly enough, it improves creativity. It's an interesting relationship that's created between the form, the space, and the people, the results of which really makes architecture, well, architecture. But where did our understanding of architectural space come from? You might be surprised. While space has always been part of our architectural language, the way we understand space today is actually a relatively new concept. In ancient architecture theory, it was always about the form. Ancient Greeks, for instance, created buildings that adhered to a strict desire for pure form. Even during the Renaissance, the rigid adherence to pure geometric forms reigned supreme. That's not to say that interior spaces were not important. Any trip to the Pantheon in Rome would prove that. But it was seen as secondary. It wasn't until 1893 that we see a change in thinking when a German art historian named Augustus Schmarsau, who said that the focus of architects should be on the interior space as opposed to the exterior form. He believed the essence of architecture lie within the interior space because it was the interior spaces that people would inhabit. This way of thinking would revolutionize architecture and inspire early modernist architects, like those in the Bauhaus movement in Germany, to start looking at different ways of reinventing architecture, including breaking away from ornamentation, stuffy rooms, and creating new kinds of spaces. Spaces that were more informal and inviting. They embraced new materials and introduced natural light to make people feel they were entering a place designed for them. Architects like Frank Lloyd Wright played with space to create compression points, to make a space feel grander, when in reality, it wasn't. This new concept of space opened up so many new doors and possibilities for architects. And in the 100-some years since modernism, our architecture has created some truly fascinating architectural spaces. Spaces that have inspired so many people. Now that we know where some of our understanding of architectural space comes from, let's use that and examine some very important and significant architectural spaces throughout history. Let's begin over at Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum in New York City, where the usual unimpressive, highly ornate art galleries of the past were turned upside down into a large atrium defined by a spiraling ramp. It's a fantastic example of space. The sloping walls and that spiraling ramp all come together to create a vibrant interaction between the space, the visitors interacting with the space, and the art itself. The large atrium creates that soaring, freeing feeling, and the sloping walls and continuously moving ramp evokes motion and creates a kinetic energy that our brain registers and encourages us to move and explore. Another classical example of architectural space could easily be Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion. The form of the pavilion is rather simple, with a low-to-the-ground profile topped with a thin, flat roof. This brings the space, created by the minimal walls, to the forefront. There's no clearly defined rooms, no predetermined path to follow, which is the pavilion's strength, mainly because the pavilion feels open and free, something that was incredibly rare when the pavilion was built in the 1920s. What also contributes to this openness is the way Mies blurs the lines between the inside and the outside. It's because of these features that we're attracted to the space, because it gives us a connection as to what makes us human. That connection to nature, light, and rich materials. So now that we know what space is, and have examined some of the most successful spaces in architecture history, how do we go about designing better spaces in the future? I think we must always keep with creating spaces that are lively, visually interesting, and make people feel alive. If architects can continue to create these kinds of spaces, architecture will only get better and make our lives better in the process. And there you have it, our first episode of our Architecture 101 series. Let me know what your thoughts are about the episode in the comments section below. And let's continue the conversation about what your favorite architectural spaces are. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'm Steve, and I'll see you next time on All Things Architecture.